Hey, it's Patrick from J&P Cycles, and let's talk engine terminology, specifically Harley-Davidson big twins. But let's lay down a little bit of groundwork before we get too off into the weeds. As with a lot of Harley-Davidson terminology, we can go off down little tunnels and sidebars and things like that. But for this video, we're gonna try to streamline that for you and kind of give you a little bit of a history on what is the Harley-Davidson big twin. So the majority of the motors we're gonna be talking about today are air-cooled, pushrod actuated, 45-degree V-twin motors. And I'll break that down a little bit for you here so we know exactly what we're talking about. So when we talk about a V-twin motor, that is the heartbeat, the centerpiece of Harley-Davidson. And what that means is there's two cylinders, hence twin, and they're in a V, and they're in a 45-degree V-twin, meaning angle where those two cylinders come together is 45 degrees. If you go into other types of manufacturers, you'll see things like 60-degree twins and things like that, where Harley typically stays with the 45-degree V-twin. Air-cooled, pretty self-explanatory. Most of these engines use the air to cool them. That's why they have all those fins on the cylinders and heads, and that's what actually cools the motor off. Now, in a few instances, as we get down the line with the Harley motors, there are options for oil-cooled motors and liquid-cooled motors. A liquid-cooled motor would be much like a car or a late-model motorcycle where they have radiators and they pump coolant through the engine to cool it off. Oil-cooled motor is quite simply how it sounds. It's kind of the same scenario with a liquid-cooled motor, only you're using oil to pump through those passages to cool it off. Let's talk a little bit more about the Harley engine configuration. And you heard me say pushrod actuated. What that means is these have cams in the lower part of the motor in the crankcase. The cam spins around and there's push rods that push up and down off the cam and actuate the valves on the top of the motor via rocker boxes. Rocker boxes hold rocker arms, and when the push rod pushes up on the rocker arm, it pushes the valve down. And there you have it, Bob's your uncle, combustion. Now, what are we talking about with the big twin? This can get a little bit gray here and there, but basically when somebody refers to a big twin Harley, they're referring to kind of the bigger models in the range. So not a Sportster, I'm not gonna include a V-Rod in this, none of your XGs. We're just gonna stay with like baggers, Dynas, Softails, things like that. Those are the big twin range, and we're gonna go back farther there, so we're gonna be talking about older models too. Now, some people will include the old F-head stuff on this. I'm not going that far back. We're gonna begin with flathead. To me, the flathead was the first real big twin. And what it means by flathead is top of the head's actually kind of flat. The reason for that is there's no rockers up there. The flathead was a 45 cubic inch motor that used the pop-up style valves that were actually in the cylinder. This is, in my book, Harley's longest running motor. They used this motor from 1930 to 1948 in their motorcycle models, but it actually got used all the way into 1973 in the Cervicar models. What the Cervicar is it was kind of basically a trike, like a utilitarian trike. You've probably seen them from everything from military applications to like ice cream delivery and milk delivery. Those old Cervicars were used for all kinds of utilitarian options for a long time. So the flathead technically ran from 1930 to 1973. So the flathead gave way to the knucklehead in 1936. The knucklehead ran from 36 to 47. And what's important about the knucklehead is it was an overhead valve model. So now we move into pushrod actuation and kind of that same design that carries through in Harley-Davidson big twin engines today. The reason it was called a knucklehead is because the rocker tops on top of the cylinder heads were shaped like big knuckles. They had two big bolts on the rockers that looked like big knuckles. So they were 61 cubic inches, they had cast iron heads, cast iron cylinders, and they ran all the way up to 1947 before they gave way to the panhead. So in 1948, the knucklehead gave way to the panhead which ran all the way up until 1965. The Panhead was unique because they started using an aluminum cylinder head, which allowed them to actually get more horsepower out of the engine. Now, why was it called a Panhead? Kind of like the Knucklehead. The tops of those rocker covers looked like two big old pans, almost like two big saucepans sitting up there. Panhead was also started out as 61 cubic inches and then later on moved into 74 cubic inches. In 1966, it gave way to the Shovelhead. In 1966, Harley moves into the Shovelhead era. You guessed it, those rocker tops are shaped like shovels. Now the Shovelhead was a better flowing cylinder head, which resulted in more power, but it used basically that same Panhead generator style bottom end up until 1970 before they moved into the alternator model or the nose cone shovel, which we are all so familiar with. Now in 1978, they bumped that 74 cubic inch displacement Shovelhead up to an 80 inch, and that ran all the way into technically 85. A lot of people think Shovelhead died in 84. It was actually available in a couple models up until 85. Something Harley is known for is running a couple of extra years out of a certain component. That gave way to the Evolution motor in 1984/85. That motor not only utilized aluminum cylinder heads, but aluminum cylinders, and it was also 80 inches and was a long running component all the way up until 99. Again, there's an exception here. That exception being the FXR4 comes back in 2000 and it also has an Evolution engine while everything else is running twin cam. Twin cam is what came after the Evolution setup. Much like its name suggests, it has two cams as opposed to the single cam Evolution model. Again, this was a better designed motor, more power, ran a little bit cooler, and the twin cam was available in 88-inch versions, 96-inch versions, 103-inch versions, and even 110-inch versions in some of the Screaming Eagle packages. The twin cam ran from 99 all the way up until 2017, which brings us to the current version of the Harley Big Twin, the Milwaukee-EIGHT. Now, kind of some big changes in Harley land in the Big Twin era with this Milwaukee-EIGHT engine. The biggest of those being 4-valve heads, which meaning much better airflow, equating in much better performance, and that's where we get the name Milwaukee-EIGHT. Harley-Davidson's from Milwaukee. We have 4 valves on each head, 2 cylinders, that's 8-valve Milwaukee-EIGHT. Harley-Davidson math for you right there. Milwaukee-EIGHT is now the current Big Twin motor that is gracing all of the Harley-Davidson Big Twin platforms, those being all of the baggers and all of the soft tails. And like I alluded to before, for the most part, these are air-cooled engines. There are a couple of random liquid-cooled versions on some higher-end baggers and trikes, and of course, oil cooling with an oil cooler does count as oil cooling, but for the most part, we're dealing with air-cooled engines. This can be complicated, it can be confusing, it doesn't have to be. I try to distill this down to the bare nuts and bolts for you guys out there who are often confused by Harley's alphabet soup and running off in one direction or another of year ranges. If you have any questions, feel free to drop us a comment. Go work on those motorcycles.